My name is Sarah. I am 26 years old. People often see me as quiet, polite, and hardworking, but very few know the storms I carry inside me. Life has not been kind. Life has not been fair. Yet somehow, I am still here, breathing, moving forward, even when my heart feels too heavy to carry. I grew up in a small town in Washington. My parents were simple people, kind and loving. My father worked as a mechanic, and my mother stayed home to take care of me and my younger brother, Daniel. We didn't have much, but we had enough. We had dinners together, we laughed at silly things, and sometimes we even dreamed about going on vacations we could never afford. But all of that ended one night when I was 18. It was late winter. The roads were icy, and the snow had been falling heavily since afternoon. My parents had gone out to visit my grandmother, who was sick. Daniel and I stayed home because we had school the next morning. I remember the way I fell asleep on the couch, the television still on, when the phone rang. That call changed everything. There had been an accident. A truck lost control on the highway, crashing into my parents' car. They didn't survive. I don't remember much of that night, except the way Daniel screamed when I told him, and the way my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. From that moment, my life was divided into two parts, the time when I had a family, and the time after. Suddenly, I wasn't just a sister. I was a guardian. I was only 18, barely an adult, but the weight of responsibility fell on my shoulders. Daniel was just 12, too young to understand what life had stolen from us. I promised myself, through tears and sleepless nights, that I would take care of him no matter what. But promises are easy to make when your heart is broken. Keeping them is much harder. I worked 2 part-time jobs while finishing college classes. I cleaned houses on weekends, worked at a bookstore in the evenings, and studied late into the night. Sometimes I was so tired I couldn't think straight, but giving up was never an option. Daniel needed me. He was my only family left, and I couldn't fail him. Still, no matter how hard I tried, the grief never left. It followed me everywhere, like a shadow I could not escape. At night, I would lie awake listening to the silence of our small apartment, and I would cry into my pillow so Daniel wouldn't hear me. I wanted to be strong for him, but inside, I was breaking a little more each day. The worst part was pretending everything was fine. People would smile at me, say, "You're so brave, Sarah. You're so strong." I hated those words. I wasn't strong. I was surviving because I had no choice. And yet, even in the middle of that pain, a small part of me kept hoping that life wouldn't always feel this heavy, that maybe one day things could be better. But that hope was fragile, and it almost disappeared 2 years later. Daniel was 15 then. He had started hanging out with the wrong crowd at school, kids who skipped classes, smoked, and picked fights. I tried to guide him, tried to be both sister and parent, but he began to push me away. He accused me of controlling his life, of acting like mom. His words cut deep, because he didn't understand that everything I did was to protect him. One night, he didn't come home. I called his phone again and again, but he didn't answer. I walked the streets for hours, searching, terrified that something had happened. Finally, near midnight, I found him at a park with his friends. His eyes were red, and I could smell alcohol on his breath. That night, when we returned home, we had the worst fight of our lives. He shouted, I shouted back, and in the end, he slammed the door to his room, leaving me crying on the kitchen floor. It was then, in that broken moment, that I reached the breaking point. All the pain I had carried since that icy night years ago came crashing down. I felt like I had failed as a sister, failed as a parent, failed as a person. For the first time, I wondered if Daniel would have been better off without me. The thought scared me, but I couldn't push it away. I sat there in the darkness, hugging my knees, and whispered to myself, I can't do this anymore. I'm not strong enough. But deep inside, a tiny voice argued back. You promised. You can't give up. Not yet. That night, I didn't know it, but it was the beginning of a journey through pain, mistakes, small victories, and fragile hope. A journey that would test me again and again. This was my life. A life of pain. But also, somehow, a life of hope. After that night, when Daniel slammed his door and I sat alone in the kitchen, something inside me shifted. I realized that life wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about walking through shadows every single day, trying to find pieces of light in the darkness. My routine became mechanical. I woke up early, made breakfast, went to work, came home, cooked dinner, and tried to keep Daniel on track with school. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary life, but inside, I felt like I was drowning. Every smile I gave at work felt forced. Every laugh I shared with friends felt hollow. I was existing, but not living. The grief of losing my parents still haunted me. I couldn't walk past a car accident on the news without my chest tightening. I couldn't hear the sound of snow crunching under my shoes in winter without remembering that night. Even ordinary things, like seeing families eating together in restaurants, were like knives to my heart. I envied them, envied their laughter, their casual love. Daniel, on the other hand, was struggling in his own way. He carried his pain differently. Sometimes he would avoid me for days, hiding in his room with music blasting through his headphones. Other times, he would sit at the table silently, staring at his plate but not eating, his eyes empty. I wanted to reach him, to tell him that I understood, but every time I tried, he pulled further away. I often wondered if I was the problem. Maybe I was too strict. Maybe I was too young to raise him properly. I wasn't our mother, no matter how much I tried to fill her shoes. That thought alone filled me with guilt. I wasn't enough for him. And yet, I had no choice but to keep trying. Money was another shadow I lived under. The weight of bills, rent, and groceries was always on my mind. I worked at a small cafe during the day and sometimes cleaned offices at night. My body ached constantly, but the paycheck was never enough. Every month, I sat at the kitchen table with receipts spread out, praying that the numbers would somehow stretch. They rarely did. There were nights when I skipped dinner so Daniel could eat more. He never knew. I would tell him I wasn't hungry, but the truth was my stomach ached with emptiness. The worst part was hiding it, pretending everything was fine so he wouldn't worry. Living in shadows meant keeping secrets like these, sacrificing silently while hoping it would make his life a little easier. Yet even in those dark days, there were small sparks of hope that kept me going. Sometimes, it was Daniel himself. I remember one morning when he surprised me with a cup of coffee before school. He didn't say much, just placed it on the table beside me and muttered, "You work too hard." It was such a small thing, but it made me cry after he left. In his own quiet way, he cared. He just didn't know how to show it. Other times, hope came from strangers. Once, while I was working at the cafe, an old woman came in. She ordered tea and sat near the window. I brought her the cup, and she looked up at me with warm eyes and said, "You have a kind face. Don't lose it, no matter what life does to you." She didn't know me, didn't know my story, but her words sank deep into my heart. For a moment, I felt seen. But shadows have a way of pulling you back. The stress of juggling everything, the grief, the money, the responsibility, took a toll on my health. I started getting constant headaches. Sleep never came easily. My body was tired, but my mind refused to rest. At night, I would lie awake thinking of all the ways life had gone wrong, all the ways I might fail Daniel. Sometimes I even thought about running away, disappearing, so he could have a chance at something better. But every time that thought came, I reminded myself of the promise I made the night our parents died, I will protect him, no matter what. Still, there were days when that promise felt like a chain, binding me to a life I didn't want. And that guilt, that I even thought such a thing, was another shadow I carried. Living in shadows meant walking a line between despair and hope every single day. Some mornings, I wanted to give up. But then I would see Daniel getting ready for school, his hair messy, his shoes untied, and I would remember that he still needed me. That was enough to keep me moving, one step at a time. Looking back now, I realize that shadows aren't just about darkness. They're proof that light exists somewhere close by. You can't have one without the other. At that time, I didn't understand it fully, but a small part of me knew. My life wasn't just pain. Somewhere in all of it, hope was waiting. I just had to keep walking long enough to find it. Life has a strange way of giving you small gifts when you least expect them. They don't erase the pain, they don't fix everything, but they remind you that not all days are dark. For me, that flicker of light came one autumn afternoon. I was working at the cafe, exhausted as usual. The day had been long, filled with customers rushing in and out, leaving me with aching feet and a sore back. The manager had asked me to stay an extra hour because someone called in sick. I wanted to say no, but we needed the money. So, I tied my apron tighter and kept going. That's when he walked in. He wasn't anyone special at first glance, just another customer. Tall, brown hair a little messy, wearing a gray coat that looked too thin for the chilly weather. He ordered black coffee, nothing fancy, and sat down at a corner table with a stack of papers. But what caught my attention was his smile when I brought him the cup. It wasn't just polite. It was warm, like he actually saw me, not just the uniform, not just the tired waitress. "Thank you," he said softly, meeting my eyes. I nodded quickly, a little embarrassed, and went back behind the counter. But for some reason, my heart felt lighter. He became a regular. Every few days, he showed up around the same time, always with papers in hand, always ordering black coffee. Sometimes he stayed for an hour, sometimes just 10 minutes, but he always smiled at me. He started making small talk, asking how my day was, if I was in school, what books I liked to read. Simple things, but no one else really asked me those questions. His name was Ethan. He told me he was a writer, working on his first novel. I laughed at the idea, not because I doubted him, but because it felt so different from my world of bills and responsibilities. A novel? Who had time to dream like that? Yet, the way he spoke about it made me believe him. He had hope in his voice, and it was contagious. At first, I kept my guard up. I didn't want anyone to get too close. My life was messy, filled with pain I didn't want to explain. But slowly, I found myself looking forward to his visits. I would catch myself checking the door around the time he usually came in. And when he did walk through, my chest felt lighter, like maybe the world wasn't such a cruel place after all. One evening, after the cafe closed, I found myself walking home under the glow of streetlights. My hands were cold, and my thoughts were heavy, as usual. Then I heard footsteps beside me. "Hey," Ethan said, his voice gentle. "You shouldn't walk alone this late." I was startled but not afraid. Somehow, I trusted him. We walked together in silence for a while, our breaths visible in the cool air. Then he spoke. "You always look tired," he said carefully, not as a criticism but as an observation. "Like you're carrying the weight of the world." I forced a laugh. "Maybe I am." He glanced at me, his expression serious. "Well, you shouldn't have to carry it alone." Those words broke something inside me. For years, I had carried everything, grief, responsibility, fear, without letting anyone help. And here was this stranger, offering kindness without asking for anything in return. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. That night, for the first time in a long while, I felt hope stir in my heart. Just a flicker, faint and fragile, but it was there. Over the next few weeks, Ethan and I talked more. He would tell me about his struggles with writing, how sometimes the words wouldn't come, how he doubted if anyone would ever read his book. And I would listen, giving small bits of encouragement. What surprised me most was how much he listened to me too. I told him about Daniel, about working 2 jobs, about losing my parents. I didn't tell many people those things, but with him, the words just spilled out. He didn't judge. He didn't offer easy answers. He just listened, and somehow, that was enough. One evening, as I locked up the cafe, Ethan waited outside with 2 cups of hot chocolate. "For you," he said, handing me one. "Coffee keeps you awake. This might help you sleep better." I laughed softly, touched by the gesture. It was such a small thing, but it meant the world to me. That night, as I sipped the warm drink on my walk home, I realized something: pain doesn't erase hope, and hope doesn't erase pain. They can exist together, side by side. And sometimes, hope shows up in the form of a kind stranger with a smile and a cup of hot chocolate. It was just a flicker of light. But in a life full of shadows, even a flicker can feel like the beginning of something new. Love is a strange thing. It can heal you, but it can also feel heavy, like a burden you're afraid to carry. For me, love was not just about romance, it was about responsibility, sacrifice, and the fear of losing again. I loved Daniel, my younger brother, more than anyone in the world. From the moment our parents died, I promised myself I would protect him. But the weight of that promise sometimes crushed me. Every choice I made, every step I took, was measured by how it might affect him. It wasn't just about me anymore, it hadn't been for years. Still, when Ethan entered my life, I felt something shift. He brought warmth into days that were otherwise cold. He gave me hope I didn't know I needed. But that hope came with its own weight. Because deep down, I feared what love could do. What if I let him in and lost him, just like I lost my parents? What if caring for him distracted me from caring for Daniel? What if happiness was a risk I couldn't afford? These thoughts haunted me every time Ethan smiled at me, every time I caught myself smiling back. Daniel noticed too. One evening, as I cooked dinner, he leaned against the kitchen counter, watching me. "You've been smiling a lot lately," he said, raising an eyebrow. I tried to play it off. "Have I? Must be the onions." He smirked, not buying it. "It's that guy, isn't it? The one who walks you home sometimes." Heat rose to my cheeks. "His name is Ethan. And he's just a friend." Daniel gave me a look that said he didn't believe a word of it. But instead of teasing, he grew serious. "I don't want you to get hurt," he said quietly. The word struck me hard. He was only 17, but sometimes he spoke with a weight far beyond his years. I realized that he carried fears too, fears of losing me, fears of being left alone. My love for Ethan wasn't just mine to hold, it rippled through Daniel's life as well. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about what love really meant. It wasn't just the butterflies in my stomach when Ethan smiled. It wasn't just the warmth of his kindness. It was also the responsibility of balancing that love with the promise I had made to Daniel. The weight of love was knowing that one wrong step could hurt the people I cared about most. But love has a way of finding its place, even under heavy burdens. One weekend, Ethan invited me to the park. It wasn't anything fancy, just a walk under golden autumn leaves. We sat on a bench, sipping coffee, watching children play nearby. For a while, we didn't talk. The silence was comfortable, peaceful. Then Ethan turned to me. "You always look like you're carrying something heavy. Like your heart is full of things you don't say." I stared at him, unsure how to respond. "You don't have to tell me everything," he continued softly. "But you should know, you don't have to carry it alone." Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. I looked away, ashamed of breaking down in front of him. But Ethan didn't push. He just sat there, letting me breathe, letting me feel. Finally, I whispered, "I'm scared of love." He didn't laugh. He didn't ask why. He just nodded, as if he understood. And in that moment, I realized that maybe love didn't have to be so heavy. Maybe it wasn't about perfection or promises you could never break. Maybe it was about sharing the weight so it didn't crush you. That night, when I returned home, Daniel was on the couch with his homework spread out. He looked up at me and asked, "Did you have fun?" I smiled, brushing a hand over his messy hair. "Yeah. I did." He gave a small nod, almost approving, before going back to his books. And in that tiny gesture, I felt something shift. Maybe he was beginning to understand that love didn't take me away from him, it could make me stronger for both of us. The weight of love hadn't disappeared. But now, it didn't feel like a chain around my neck. It felt like a responsibility I could carry, as long as I didn't carry it alone. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that love, whether for my brother or for Ethan, didn't have to destroy me. It could save me. Life has a way of testing you. It piles one burden after another, waiting to see when you'll finally collapse. I had held on for years, keeping everything together with fragile strength. But everyone has a breaking point, and I finally reached mine. It started with bills. The rent went up, and even though I worked 2 jobs, the numbers just didn't add up anymore. Every time I looked at the paper, I felt like the walls were closing in. Groceries, electricity, Daniel's school expenses, it all stacked against me like an endless mountain I could never climb. Then Daniel got sick. It wasn't serious, just a fever and cough, but it terrified me. Memories of hospitals and my parents' sudden death came rushing back. I hovered by his bedside, checking his temperature every hour, even when he begged me to stop worrying. "You need to sleep," he mumbled weakly. But I couldn't. Because what if something happened while I closed my eyes? What if I lost him too? The exhaustion built like a storm inside me. I went to work with heavy eyes and trembling hands. At the cafe, I dropped a tray of mugs. At the bookstore, I forgot to charge a customer. My managers frowned, their patience wearing thin. I could feel it, one mistake away from losing everything. Ethan noticed. "You're burning yourself out," he said one evening as we sat outside the cafe after my shift. "You can't keep going like this." I shook my head, frustration boiling over. What choice do I have? If I don't work, we don't eat. If I don't push myself, Daniel doesn't get a future. There's no room for rest. His eyes softened, but his words were firm. "Olivia, you can't save anyone if you destroy yourself." The truth in his voice broke me. Tears spilled down my face before I could stop them. I buried my face in my hands, ashamed of crying in public. But Ethan just pulled me into a quiet hug, letting me shake and sob against his chest. "I can't do this anymore," I whispered, the words tasting like failure. But he held me tighter. "Yes, you can. Just not alone." That night, after Daniel had fallen asleep, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the overdue bills. The numbers blurred through my tears. For the first time, I allowed myself to admit what I had been avoiding: I was drowning. I thought about my parents. About the promise I had made at 19. I swore I would protect Daniel, no matter the cost. But I hadn't realized the cost might be myself. And then, something inside me snapped. I stood up so suddenly the chair scraped against the floor. My chest heaved with anger, fear, and grief all tangled together. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to finally let out all the pain I had bottled up for years. Instead, I grabbed my jacket and stormed outside. The night air was cold, biting against my skin, but I welcomed it. I walked aimlessly, each step heavy with rage and despair. Finally, I ended up at the park where Ethan and I had once sat. I dropped onto the bench, trembling, tears streaming freely. For the first time, I admitted the thought that had haunted me in secret: what if I can't do this? What if I fail him? The guilt nearly crushed me. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in the storm of my thoughts, but then I heard a voice. "Olivia?" It was Ethan. He had been walking nearby, and when he saw me, his face filled with concern. Without hesitation, he sat beside me. "What happened?" he asked gently. And something inside me broke wide open. I told him everything: the bills, the exhaustion, the fear of losing Daniel, the crushing weight of responsibility. My words poured out like a flood, messy and desperate. When I finally ran out of breath, Ethan took my hand. "You don't have to carry all of this alone," he said firmly. "There are people who care about you. About Daniel. Let us help." I shook my head. I don't know how. Start by letting yourself lean on someone. Even just a little. His voice was steady, grounding me in the chaos. For the first time in weeks, my breathing slowed. The storm inside me calmed, just a little. That night didn't solve everything. The bills didn't disappear, the responsibilities didn't vanish. But something changed in me. I realized that strength isn't about never breaking. Strength is about breaking, then finding the courage to keep going anyway. The breaking point wasn't the end. It was the beginning of learning that hope doesn't always come in the form of solutions, it sometimes comes in the form of a hand to hold when you feel like falling apart. Healing doesn't happen all at once. It's not like waking up one morning and realizing the pain is gone. No, healing is slow. It's messy. It's full of small steps forward and unexpected steps back. For me, the road to healing began the night I broke down on that park bench. After that evening, Ethan became a constant presence in my life. Not in an overwhelming way, but in quiet, steady ways that mattered. He would text me in the morning, just a simple, "Don't forget to eat breakfast" or "Have a good day." He would show up after my late shifts with warm coffee in his hand, walking me home without asking for anything in return. At first, I felt guilty for letting him in. I had built walls around my heart, convinced that needing someone was weakness. But slowly, his kindness began to chip away at those walls. Daniel noticed too. One afternoon, while doing his homework, he looked up at me and said, "You laugh more now." I blinked in surprise. "Do I?" "Yeah," he said with a small smile. "It's nice." That simple comment stayed with me. Maybe I had been living in survival mode for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to smile without forcing it. But healing wasn't just about Ethan. It was about facing my own fears. I started writing again, something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. Late at night, when Daniel was asleep, I would pour my thoughts into a notebook. Sometimes it was poetry, sometimes just messy feelings that made no sense. But it helped. It gave me a place to put the pain that weighed me down. One evening, Ethan found the notebook on the table. I panicked, rushing to grab it from him, but he held it gently. "You write beautifully," he said softly. I froze. "You read it?" "Just one page," he admitted, then handed it back without pressure. "I won't read more if you don't want me to." "But Olivia, your words matter." "You matter." That was the first time in years I felt truly seen. Healing also meant learning to forgive myself. For so long, I blamed myself for not being enough, for Daniel, for my parents, for everything that went wrong. But slowly, I realized that carrying guilt didn't honor their memory. Living, truly living, was what they would have wanted for me. I took small steps. I applied for a better-paying job at the library, one that would allow me to cut down my extra shifts. I started cooking proper meals instead of just reheating leftovers. Daniel and I even began taking short walks together after dinner, talking about school, about life, about silly things that made us laugh. But the road to healing wasn't perfect. There were days I still felt crushed by fear, days when the weight of the past pressed down on me so hard I could barely move. On those days, I wanted to push Ethan away, to hide behind the walls I had built for protection. One night, after an argument about nothing, really just my frustration spilling over, I told him, "Maybe you should stay away from me. I'm too broken." Ethan didn't leave. He looked at me with steady eyes and said, "Olivia, healing doesn't mean pretending you're not broken. It means letting someone love you even when you are." His words sank deep into me. I realized healing wasn't about becoming perfect. It was about allowing myself to be human. The turning point came when Daniel, out of the blue, said, "You know, I don't feel scared anymore." That caught me off guard. "Scared? Of what?" "Of losing you," he said simply. "You seem stronger now. And when Ethan's around, it feels like we're not alone." I couldn't hold back my tears. Hearing that from him showed me how far we had come. Maybe healing wasn't just about me, it was about both of us finding peace together. As the days passed, I realized healing wasn't a destination. It was a journey. Some days were bright, full of laughter and hope. Others were darker, heavy with memories. But I was no longer walking that road alone. And for the first time in years, the road ahead didn't terrify me. It felt possible. It felt hopeful. Healing was slow. Healing was painful. But healing was happening. Life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. For years, I thought my story was only about pain, loss, and survival. But slowly, almost quietly, life began to show me something different, new beginnings. It started with small changes. The library job I had applied for called me back. I still remember the nervous energy as I walked into the interview, clutching my worn-out bag and reminding myself not to fidget. The manager, a kind woman with silver hair, asked me about books, about why I wanted the job. For the first time, I spoke with honesty instead of desperation. I've always believed stories can save us, I told her. They remind us that even in darkness, there's always another chapter. A week later, I was hired. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid better, and it gave me something I hadn't felt in years: stability. I could breathe without the constant fear of overdue bills. Daniel noticed the difference too. Our little apartment felt lighter, less burdened by worry. New beginnings also showed up in Ethan. Our relationship had grown quietly, like a seed planted in broken soil. He didn't push me, he simply stood beside me, day after day, until one evening I realized I couldn't imagine life without him. We were walking home, Daniel skipping a few steps ahead of us. The city lights glowed around us, and Ethan reached for my hand. "You know," he said softly, "you're stronger than you think." I smiled, squeezing his hand. "And you're more patient than anyone I've ever met." It wasn't a grand confession, but in that moment, it was enough. Something had shifted. I was no longer surviving alone. I was beginning to live with someone by my side. Daniel, ever observant, teased me relentlessly. "You like him," he'd say with a mischievous grin. I'd roll my eyes, but inside, I knew he was right. And instead of being scared of that truth, I welcomed it. Love no longer felt like a risk I couldn't afford, it felt like a chance at something I had thought I'd lost forever. But new beginnings weren't just about love and work. They were about rediscovering myself. I started setting aside time for writing again, not just late-night scribbles but real effort. I signed up for a local writing workshop, terrified at first, but surprised by the warmth of others who shared their stories. For the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere outside of my pain. One day, I read a piece aloud at the workshop. It was about loss, about raising Daniel, about nights spent crying into my pillow. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then someone said, "That was beautiful." Another added, "You're brave." I realized then that my story wasn't just pain, it was strength. And by sharing it, I was turning scars into something meaningful. Of course, fear still lingered. Change is never easy. Some nights, I would lie awake, wondering if this peace was temporary, if it would all be taken from me again. But those thoughts no longer ruled me. They were whispers, not chains. One evening, while Daniel was finishing homework, Ethan sat across from me at the kitchen table. He looked nervous, which was unusual for him. "What's wrong?" I asked. He hesitated, then said, "I don't want to rush you, Olivia. But I want to be part of this. Of your life. Of Daniel's life. Not just as someone passing through, but something more." My heart raced. A year ago, those words would have terrified me. Commitment felt like another risk, another chance to lose someone. But now, sitting across from him, I realized I wasn't afraid. "You already are," I whispered. His smile was small but full of emotion. And in that moment, I felt it, the beginning of a new chapter, not just for me, but for all of us. The past was still part of me. The pain, the fear, the long nights, they hadn't disappeared. But they no longer defined me. Instead, they had shaped me into someone who could finally embrace hope. New beginnings don't erase old wounds. But they show you that even with scars, life can still be beautiful. The future had always been something I avoided thinking about. For years, it felt like a shadow that carried only uncertainty, fear, and disappointment. I lived from one day to the next, never daring to dream too far ahead. But now, for the first time, the future no longer terrified me, it called to me. It began with small moments. One Saturday morning, Daniel and I visited the farmer's market near our neighborhood. The air smelled of fresh bread and roasted coffee, the stalls bright with colors of fruits and flowers. Daniel darted from stall to stall, his laughter filling the air. Watching him, I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. Ethan joined us later, carrying a bag of apples. He walked beside me, his hand brushing mine as if asking permission before holding it. I let him. And in that moment, I realized the future wasn't something to fear, it was something to build, together. At home, life found its rhythm. Daniel grew more confident, more relaxed, no longer weighed down by the heaviness he once carried. He started talking about dreams, wanting to play basketball, maybe even apply for college someday. His words lit up the room, and every time I heard them, I felt proud. He was finally free to dream. And me? I allowed myself to dream too. I continued writing, and with Ethan's encouragement, I submitted one of my stories to a small local magazine. The day they accepted it, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the email through tears. "Olivia," Ethan said, pulling me into his arms, "you're finally sharing your voice with the world." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so I did both. For so long, my story had been locked inside me, too painful to tell. Now, it was becoming something beautiful, something that might even inspire someone else who was struggling. But hope wasn't just about dreams, it was about choices. And the biggest choice I made was to stop living in fear. For years, I had let fear control me, the fear of loss, of failure, of being hurt again. But now, with each passing day, I chose love over fear. One evening, as the three of us sat together after dinner, Ethan turned to Daniel. "Can I ask you something?" he said gently. Daniel raised an eyebrow, suspicious. "What is it?" Ethan smiled nervously. "Would it be okay if I was officially part of this family?" Daniel blinked in surprise, then looked at me. My heart skipped a beat, but I held my breath, waiting for Daniel's response. Finally, he grinned. "As long as you promise not to embarrass me too much, I guess it's fine." We all laughed, but inside, I was overwhelmed. It wasn't a proposal, not yet, but it was a step toward a future we could build together, a future where none of us had to walk alone. The road to this point hadn't been easy. There were still scars, still nights when memories haunted me. But those scars no longer defined me. They were part of my story, yes, but not the whole story. The rest was still unwritten. One night, I stood on our apartment balcony, looking at the city lights. The world felt vast, filled with possibilities I had once been too afraid to imagine. Ethan came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" he whispered. "The future," I said softly. "For the first time, it doesn't scare me." He kissed the top of my head. "That's because it's filled with hope now. And no matter what comes, you won't face it alone." Tears filled my eyes, but they were happy tears. I thought of my parents, of the promise I made to protect Daniel, of the long nights I spent crying in silence. And I realized something: every struggle, every moment of pain, had led me here. To love. To hope. To a life I never thought possible. The future was still uncertain, as it always is. But instead of fear, I carried courage. Instead of despair, I carried dreams. And instead of loneliness, I carried love. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving, I was truly living. And that was the greatest hope of all. Thank you for watching this emotional love story on the Love Chapter by Aree. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more heart-touching stories. Tell us in the comments which country or place you are watching from. We'd love to know where our family of viewers is growing around the world.